There's a man out here who's always thinking 2 steps ahead. The fire in front of him, crackling against the wind, is proof of that. They all laughed at his so-called fool's campfire pit, but when the storm comes howling through, they'll learn he wasn't the fool after all. Before we get to this fire story, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if Frontier Ingenuity sparks your interest. Don't forget to tip your hat and subscribe for tomorrow's campfire tale. The wind howled across the flat, snow-covered plains, its icy breath biting through every layer of clothing, cutting to the bone. Jake Monroe wasn't bothered by it. Not much ever rattled him, especially not a cold wind. He'd spent enough time on the frontier to know that if a man didn't get used to the weather would get used to him, and he wouldn't be around long. The others, however, were different. They shuffled about, busy and nervous, trying to light their campfires, quickly before the storm hit hard. A handful of men, including Caleb, the youngest in the group, rushed to prepare their makeshift tents and wagons for the night. "You sure you don't want to hurry it up?" Caleb called over to Jake, his voice tight with impatience. "The cold's coming, and it's only going to get worse." Jake didn't answer. His hands worked slowly, methodically, digging into the snow and ice with the edge of his shovel. There was no rush. He'd spent too many years out here to cut corners. While the others worked quickly to get their fires set, Jake worked on his fire pit deeper than usual, wider, and with careful stonework to ensure it held. The others, cowhands and settlers all, weren't used to his pace, his caution. "You're wasting time," Caleb muttered under his breath, watching Jake's every move. "That fire's going to burn out before you even get it going, and you're putting all this effort into it, like it's going to matter." Jake didn't look up. He knew what they were saying behind his back. They always said the same thing. The same as they'd said the last time he'd stopped to build a shelter instead of throwing up some cheap boards and calling it a cabin. The same as they'd said when he spent days planning for a storm they didn't think would come only for it to break and nearly kill half the crew. This time, though, Jake was prepared. He'd built the pit carefully, layering the bottom with rocks he'd gathered from the creek bed. He knew what he was doing, even if no one else did. The cold, especially out here on the plains, could kill a man quicker than any bullet. A fire wasn't just a fire. It was the difference between survival and death. As the first gusts of wind began to sweep across the camp, Jake set to work on his fire. He carefully arranged the logs inside the pit, his motions deliberate, slow, but sure. The others didn't understand it. They rushed to build their fires in haste, hoping for warmth that would fade as soon as the wind picked up. When the fire started, Caleb didn't stop to watch, his own pit barely catching against the gusts. But Jake's fire, tucked in its deep stone pit, held strong. The flames didn't flicker. They stood firm. The warmth already spreading through the air, steady and unwavering. "Damn fool," Caleb muttered again, but the doubt in his voice was quieter this time. Jake didn't answer. He just watched the fire, knowing it would keep him warm through the storm. By the time the sun dipped low behind the hills, the wind had turned violent. The air, already heavy with snow, now carried the scent of something more dangerous. The storm wasn't just coming, it had arrived. It howled across the plains, bending the trees at awkward angles, sending flurries of ice and dust in every direction. Even with their coats pulled tight and scarves wrapped high, the men huddled close around their campfires, trying to hold on to any warmth they could find. But Jake Monroe, ever the calm one, didn't flinch. His fire pit was glowing brightly, its flames licking the sky in a defiant dance against the storm. The stone walls of the pit kept the heat close, wrapped in like a blanket on a cold night, and Jake had prepared for just this kind of weather. "Damn fool's fire pit," Caleb muttered again, his teeth chattering as he stoked the fire he had made with hurried hands. The flames sputtered weakly against the gusts, and the cold cut deep. It wasn't enough. It never was. Jake didn't answer, didn't need to. He just fed more wood into his own fire, his face calm, his eyes tracking the way the wind moved across the horizon. He knew what was coming. He could feel it in the bones of the land, in the way the air had shifted. It was more than just a snowstorm. Now this was a windstorm, the kind that could last days. The others would burn through their wood quickly. He'd already stashed enough for a week, The others began to retreat to their wagons and tents, their voices growing soft with doubt. The fire they had made, the one they thought would get them through the night, began to flicker dangerously in the face of the growing storm. Jake remained outside, his fire blazing strong, the warmth radiating in every direction. The others came out of their tents, eyes narrowing as they watched the fire hold steady against the wind. They hadn't believed in him before, but they were starting to now. The storm screamed louder, but Jake's fire refused to flicker, holding strong in the pit, stubborn against the relentless wind. One by one, the men started gathering around Jake's fire, their faces grim but silently thankful. It wasn't just the warmth they were after, it was something more. A sense of certainty. A sense that, maybe, the night wasn't going to kill them after all. Jake pulled his coat tighter around his shoulders, eyes still fixed on the flames. He had always known that survival out here was more than luck or force of will. It was about preparation. It was about foresight. It was about thinking ahead when others thought the world was already set in stone. As the night settled deeper, the winds howled louder, but Jake's fire, tucked safely in the heart of its stone pit, stood firm. The others watched from the warmth, understanding now that this wasn't just a fire, it was a lifeline. And Jake had been right all along. The storm didn't waste any time. By nightfall, the wind was howling like a pack of wolves on the hunt. The sky, darkened by thick clouds, offered no mercy. Snowflakes swirled, lashing against the camp as the men struggled to keep their fires alive. But it was the wind that was the real enemy, biting and freezing, creeping into every gap, every crack. Caleb's fire sputtered and died as quickly as it had started. The wind took no pity on his hastily built pit, scattering the embers and snuffing out the warmth with a cruel gust. He cursed loudly, struggling to gather more wood from the pile he'd stacked earlier. The others weren't faring much better. Some managed to keep their fires flickering, but none of them burned steady enough to fight off the cold. Jake Monroe, however, wasn't worried. His fire was still roaring in its deep stone pit, unshaken by the storm. The wind whipped across the open land, but it couldn't touch his flames. The stone walls of the pit shielded the fire, allowing it to thrive while the others fought just to stay warm. His pit was a fortress in the middle of chaos. One by one, the other men gathered near Jake's fire, their faces drawn and exhausted. They couldn't deny the truth. Now Jake's fire was the only one that wasn't fading with each gust of wind. They huddled together, their backs turned to the storm, their faces warmed by the fire Jake had carefully tended to. Caleb's lips tightened, but even he couldn't argue with the result. "Never thought I'd see the day," Caleb muttered, rubbing his hands together in the warmth. "Guess I was wrong." Jake didn't reply. There was no need. The fire spoke for itself. As the storm howled louder, they all grew silent, lost in their own thoughts. The wind outside raged, but the warmth from the fire was a constant, a reminder that preparation had its rewards. The others shifted uneasily as they stared at the fire, watching the flames burn steady and strong. Some men were quiet, but a few couldn't hold back their curiosity. "How did you know?" one of the drifters asked, his eyes narrow with disbelief. "How'd you know it wouldn't blow out?" Jake's gaze didn't leave the flames. "I didn't know for sure," he said quietly. "But I've been through enough storms to know that sometimes you gotta build for the worst. Not just what you expect." The wind was still howling, still tearing across the plain, but they had no choice but to rely on Jake's fire now. They'd seen the truth. In the heart of the storm, it wasn't the biggest fire or the flashiest one that mattered. It was the one built to last, to survive when everything else was breaking down. As the night dragged on, the others fell silent, their bodies warmed by the fire. And Jake Monroe, quiet and steady as always, simply kept watching the flames, knowing that the worst was still to come. By morning, the storm had only grown fiercer. The wind screamed across the camp, battering everything in its path. The snow had piled deep around the wagons, drifting high against the men's tents and the sparse trees that dotted the land. The cold was unbearable, its teeth sharp and relentless. Yet in the midst of it all, Jake Monroe's fire remained, strong, steady, and burning brightly in its deep stone pit. The others were already up, gathering their meager belongings and trying to make sense of the wreckage the storm had left behind. Their own fires, once flickering bright through the night, had long since been extinguished. The cold had crept in, frozen their food, their gear, and their spirits. Jake's fire, though, was like an oasis in the desert. The warmth radiated from it, filling the air and making the bitter wind outside seem miles away. "You got any more wood?" Caleb asked quietly, his voice hoarse from the cold. Jake glanced over. Caleb's face was pale, his breath coming out in short, shallow puffs. The fire had done what it could, but the storm was relentless. Jake nodded and gestured toward the woodpile he had carefully stacked earlier. There was still plenty to burn, more than enough to last them through the storm. But it wasn't just the firewood that mattered now, it was the lesson that had been learned the night before. Caleb stared at the fire, his brow furrowed. "You really built this fire to last, huh?" Jake didn't answer at first. He was too busy feeding the fire, carefully placing a few larger logs on top of the embers. The flames crackled, and they shifted, a steady pulse against the howling wind. The others had begun gathering around him, their cold hands reaching toward the warmth, their bodies shivering in the biting air. "We don't have much time," Jake said after a while. "This wind's only going to get worse. We need to stay close to the fire and ration what we've got. If we don't, we won't make it." The others nodded, their expressions hardening with the weight of the truth. Jake had built his fire pit to survive not just the storm, but the aftermath too. A fire like this didn't just burn, it stayed warm, long after the wind stopped. It was a shelter in itself, a place to gather around, to heal and to survive. As the hours dragged on, the storm outside continued its assault. But inside the circle of men huddled around Jake's fire, there was a sense of reluctant admiration. They had been wrong about Jake, about his slow, deliberate ways. He had known what they didn't. When the worst came, it wasn't about speed or cutting corners. It was about lasting, about holding steady against whatever came. By the time the winds began to slow, Jake's fire was still burning bright. The storm had tested them all, but only one fire had passed the test. As the storm began to ease, the wind slowly lost its bite. The sky, still heavy with clouds, started to clear just enough for the first faint light of dawn to creep across the plains. The landscape was a white, wind-blown wilderness, and the remnants of the storm still clung to the air like a ghost. But the fire that had kept them warm through the night was still burning, steady as ever, crackling and snapping in the quiet of the morning. The men were exhausted, their faces drawn and pale, but they had made it through the worst of it. Their clothes were soaked with snow and sweat, their hands sore from the work of keeping their fires going, but Jake's fire had held strong. The others now gathered around it, weary but thankful, their cold fingers reaching for any remaining warmth they could get. They hadn't spoken much through the night, save for the occasional muttered curse or thanks as the storm raged on. Now, with the wind finally dying down, the mood in the camp was more subdued. Jake sat quietly by the fire, his eyes watching the flames dance and flicker. He wasn't one for boasting, and this wasn't a time for it. The fire had done its job, it had kept them all alive, but there was no need to say anything more. Caleb was the first to speak. His voice was hoarse, his breath still visible in the morning air. "I'll be damned," he muttered, staring at the flames. "Guess I owe you an apology, Jake. That fire, it saved us. I didn't think it'd last." Jake looked over at him, his expression unreadable. "You didn't think it'd last," Jake said simply. "But you're still here, aren't you?" Caleb swallowed hard, embarrassed. He had been the loudest critic of Jake's slow, cautious methods. But now, standing here in the quiet after the storm, he realized how wrong he'd been. He nodded, silently. The others murmured in agreement, their faces marked by the strain of the storm. One by one, they looked at Jake with newfound respect. It wasn't just the fire that had saved them, it was the way Jake had thought ahead. He had seen the storm coming, even when the rest of them hadn't, and he had planned for it in a way they hadn't understood. Jake gave a small nod, but didn't say anything more. He didn't need to. He wasn't the kind of man to gloat. As the sun began to rise higher, the camp started to stir. The snow was still falling in soft flurries, but the worst of the storm was behind them. Caleb gathered up his gear, still watching Jake's fire. "I don't think I'll ever doubt you again," he said, shaking his head. "Not after this." Jake just smiled, the firelight flickering in his eyes. "You're welcome," he said quietly, and just like that, the moment passed. The others went about their work, the storm finally behind them. But the lesson had been learned. Survival wasn't about speed or taking shortcuts. It was about building for the worst, even when others laughed. And as Jake Monroe packed up his gear, he knew the frontier had a way of teaching lessons that couldn't be ignored.